Yo, what is up guys, Grim here, and welcome to my ultimate guide on combat in Honkai Star Rail, where we're going to learn the ins and outs of everything that goes on in battle in detail. So if you're looking to maximize the potential of your team and really take things to the next level, this is the video for you. Without further ado, let's get into it. Now, despite what you might believe, the battle actually starts before you even start the encounter. When you're in the overworld, you can scout the enemy and see what they're weak to. You can see this enemy here is weak to lightning. It's absolutely imperative that you do so in all game modes where you're looking to take on a challenging foe. You want to aim for your team to bring 1 to 2 members which the enemy is weak to. If you're looking to increase your team building capabilities, you can check out my ultimate guide to team building on my channel. It'll help you out a lot. Now, assuming you've got some weaknesses packed and your team is ready, the next part is going to be going ahead and stacking some techniques. Every single character has a technique at their disposal, and using a technique costs 1 technique point. But in all competitive modes, you're going to pretty much be able to max out all of your technique points before a battle. So the only limit is how many techniques you can stack before that super hard fight. There are 2 types of techniques. There is active techniques and passive techniques. Passive techniques are by far better. Let me explain why. So active techniques revolve around hitting the enemy with a technique and creating an advantageous engagement. So for example, Serval here has a technique which will create a massive lightning crash which will deal increased damage to every enemy on entry of the fight, but it starts the fight. So if I had multiple abilities and techniques like Serval's, I can't use all of them because I can only engage the enemy once. When you compare that to a passive technique like Trailblazer Fire's, it's far more powerful to use these. Trailblazer Fire can consume a technique point to give themselves a defense boost here. Now this is particularly good because combat hasn't started. Some characters can use their technique multiple times, like Ting Young to give herself multiple charges of energy. Characters like Bailu here in my party can also use their technique on top of Trailblazer here. Now I have a healing buff for my team as well. Dan Heng can give himself an attack boost. And then now we've used all of our passive buffs, so we can go ahead and initiate the fight. So you can see here we can do what's called technique stacking by stacking 3 passive buffs and then initiating with an active. Overall, this is going to create the most favorable scenario and the easiest boss fights for your team, and is effective particularly in the Forgotten Holland simulated universe. When entering a battle, the first thing you're going to want to understand is the turn order. Understanding which unit is going to move and when is very important. And also understanding how frequently a unit or enemy is going to move is also just as important. Before starting any meaningful combat, I'd recommend hitting up the options and turning on advanced speed descriptions. It's going to allow you to see how fast units are and how long it is until their turn happens. When observing the turn order, you can see a variety of different things here. You can see that each character and enemy is present once, but the character whose turn it currently is also present again. You'll notice that this ghost image here is going to be placed where the game thinks the next turn for this character will happen. This is a pretty basic calculation which we'll go through in a second here. You can also see here the enemy has 2 actions queued. It means that they're going to make 2 moves in their single action. Many boss enemies have this mechanic, so you can pretty much bet that you're going to have to face off against this. Now fortunately, ultimates, which are able to be used at any point in battle, can actually weave in between these 2 enemy actions, even though they do look like they're stacked in one singular action. Furthermore, you can notice a number here. This is not the character's speed, this is what's called the character's action value. And we'll go over what that is and how it's determined in a second here. Speed is a stat many people think is super complicated, but it's actually super basic when it's explained to you. The only thing you need to understand is how the turn queue works and action point values. So as described earlier, this number here is each character's current action value in combat. Now this value is calculated real time anytime a character makes a move. So if my Dan Heng was going to make a move right now, he would basically rejoin the queue all the way down here and everyone else would move up. And the numbers associated with the action point value would also update based on who is now at the front of the queue. Because Serval is next in line, she will be the front of the queue, so her action point value will be deducted from everyone else's. You can see that in action here. If I attack this enemy, we can see that everyone else will move up based on what Serval has here. If I now use Serval's ability, everyone else will move up based on Bailu's. So you can see here that Trailblazer Fire should have roughly 2 to 4 action points left before she's able to move, because Bailu will be next. So you can see here, 4 points left. And then if we continue down this line, and Dan Heng is our next unit we're looking at here, if we use Bailu, we're probably going to have, anywhere between, 61 to 63 left on Dan Heng here, and he will be the next unit we're going to be looking at using. There we go, 62, and it'll go along like so. But you'll notice that each character is not rejoining the queue with the same action point value. Dan Heng, for example, gets to rejoin with a much lower action value than, for example, Bailu. And that's because he's a much slower unit. The action point value, or starting action point value, is calculated off of how fast your unit is. The faster you are, the lower your action point value will be. Now in theory, if my Trailblazer Fire was fast enough that her action point value was actually like a 70 or an 80, she would actually rejoin the queue in front of Bailu, meaning that she would actually overtake her in the turn point value here. Now this is particularly powerful when your character is way faster than other characters. If you have a character with an action point value of 50 and another character with an action point value of 101, the character with 50 would actually get to move twice as much as the character with 101. This is really powerful, especially if you get really fast and your enemy is really slow. If you have an enemy which is slow and has an action value of 201, and you have an action value of 50, you would literally move 4 times before the enemy moves once. That is incredibly powerful and incredibly strong. So how can you tell what the base action value of your character is? Well, let's take a look. So we can see here that Dan Heng has a speed of 120. All you need to do is take the number 10,000 and divide it by the speed. So 10,000 divided by 120, and that equals 83.33. So that is Dan Heng's action point value. So if Dan Heng was to move right now, he would go in front of Bailu, and that would be just great. And that's pretty much all there is to know about speed and turn orders, outside of the fact that you can modify them with increases and reductions to speed, as well as advance and decrease of action. When it comes to increasing and decreasing and advancing forwards actions and back, all you need to know is that it's most effective to do right after a character or an enemy have just had their turn. Generally, when the action point is at its highest, that's when you want to do it. You'll get the most benefit. It's not useless as their action point value gets lower, but it's most powerful when it's highest. The final thing to understand about speed is how it works in the Forgotten Hall. Believe it or not, turns also have a action point value. Based on my testing, the first turn in the Forgotten Hall lasts 150 action points. So if you have a character who has 74 action points as their baseline, they'll get to move twice on turn 1. Pretty powerful. Every subsequent turn after the first one is 100 action points long. So the faster you move, the more turns you'll get in the Forgotten Hall. Alright, now that you have quite literally mastered speed and you are basically the Flash, let's talk about something a little bit more simple, and that is skill point management. So when you start a battle, you will start the battle with 3 skill points baseline. This can be improved using gear and some character effects, but you'll have 3 most of the time. Now, when you have a character, they can perform 3 actions. If it's their turn, they can use a basic attack, or they can use a skill. A basic attack will generate 1 skill point, and a skill will consume 1 skill point. Skills are vastly superior to basic attacks in every single way, shape, and form. So if you could have it your way, you'd have all of your characters use their skill. But if all 4 of your characters use their skill every single turn, you would run out of skill points in 1 turn, and then you would have no skill points left. So in order to balance things out, 2 of your characters should use their skill per turn, and 2 of them should use their basic attack. That's going to give you a normalized kind of skill point generation there. Of course, in some turns you can go ahead and generate extra and have 3 units use basic attacks and 1 use their skill. And in some turns you can go ham and have 3 of your units use their skill and only 1 use a basic. But overall, you can't really go too much off that path. 2 basics and 2 skills is recommended to keep things normal. Now, in addition to that, you can also use ultimates. Ultimates ignore the turn order and can be used before an attack, after an enemy, before an enemy, in between an enemy's attacks, anytime you want. And that is particularly powerful. In order to use an ultimate, you first need energy. Every single character's ultimate costs a different amount of energy, generally anywhere between 100 to 140 with the current units in the game. Basic attacks generate 20 energy and skills generate 30 energy. Some characters also have things like follow-up attacks which also generate energy and other abilities, but for the most part it's 20 and 30 and that's it. After using an ultimate, you'll also be refunded 5 energy just for good measure. So overall, managing which character is using a basic and skill and ultimate is very important in combat. So how does this play out? Well, generally you're going to have 2 damage dealers spamming their skills, a healer using predominantly basics, and a support using predominantly basics. If you want to know more about team building and how to construct good, well-rounded teams, you can check out my ultimate guide to team building as well on my channel. The last thing we're going to cover here is vulnerabilities, break bars, and resistances. Alright, let's start out with the easy one first, resistances. So when you're tackling an enemy, or when you're even looking at an enemy in the Forgotten Hall or simulated universe, you can actually see what the enemy is resistant to. And this is incredibly important when building a team, not only, but also in combat and deciding whose skill you're going to use and when. So this character here, or enemy here, is resistant to ice. He's also immune to freeze. So it's not going to be a very good idea to bring an ice unit to this fight. The amount of mitigation that this one resistance gives is absolutely astounding, so definitely spectate that and take a look at what the enemy is resistant to. In addition to that, you can also see what the enemy is vulnerable to here. If an enemy is vulnerable to a unit that you have, well, you're going to be able to deal break bar damage to them. The break bar is this white bar up here. Now the game is actually kind enough to show you how much break bar damage you're going to deal to the enemy. You can see here that my basic attack on Serval, which is lightning, is going to do 1 break bar unit to this enemy. Now if I was to highlight with the skill, you can notice that this bar actually doubles and becomes twice as big as it was with the basic attack. That's because the skill of Serval actually does 2 break bar units of damage to the break bar here. Now this is actually particularly interesting when you consider the ultimate, which is actually going to deal, I think, 3 break bars. Actually, it deals 2 as well. So you can spectate just how much break bar each ability of your character is going to deal to the enemy, and this is a pretty interesting way to deal damage to the enemy. After completely breaking a break bar, the enemy will take a large amount of elemental damage according to who broke the break bar. So if Serval broke it here, it would take lightning damage. In addition to that, they will also be inflicted with an elemental ailment corresponding to the character that broke it. So if I broke a break bar with Serval, they'll take lightning ailment, which is shock. Each ailment is a little bit different and has their own ups and downs. For the most part though, most ailments will deal an upfront big damage nuke, accompanied by a dot or crowd control effect. Something like Freeze has a great crowd control effect but doesn't do much damage. Something like Ignite has a reasonable dot, a reasonable bit of damage. Something like Wind Shear has a really low initial damage but a big dot. And something like Physical Bleed has a big initial hit but a relatively weak dot. So you can see there, that's how it works. Currently, there is no way to increase the amount of units that you can deal as break damage to a break bar outside of the simulated universe. But you can increase the amount of damage that you deal as a result of a break and from the resulting dot that comes from a break. This is by a stat called break effect. Now, currently, the amount of damage you deal on break is not impacted by any attack stat or anything on your character. It's determined by how large the break bar is on the enemy, its level, and the overall stats of the enemy. Now, if you do want to increase the nuke that you're doing when you break the break bar though, you're going to want to be looking for a stat called break effect. You can see here, break effect. If you were going to break a break bar and deal 4,000 damage, and you had a 100% increased break effect, that damage would become 8,000. Now, as I mentioned, it's based on the enemy you are fighting. So overall, not only are you going to have to break the break bar with the actual unit which has the increased break effect, but you also need to make sure that you actually line it up perfectly. So it is definitely a little bit of an awkward mechanic, but it can be a pretty big payoff if you get it right. Now, units are all not created equally. A unit like Asta's skill actually breaks way more than 2 break bars worth of break. It actually breaks something more like 4, sometimes 5 if you have the idle on. So overall, it's going to be on a case-by-case basis which unit you bring to counteract the vulnerabilities of an enemy, and also which units are best at breaking break bars. So there's definitely a ton of nuance here, and you're going to have to look up the reviews on characters and really understand and do your research on how to build a character and when to bring them. Some enemies have truly immense powered up attacks which take multiple turns to come into effect. Normally these are accompanied by a targeting reticle on the party members they are actually focusing on. Now, breaking this enemy's break bar generally will disable that charge up effect and they cancel the move that they were trying to go for. As such, you're going to want to spectate what abilities the enemy has when going into combat and making sure you pay attention to the ebbs and flows of battle. In addition to that, some enemies have special hold effects, like the minions from Svarog. They will encapsulate and critically injure one of your party members and hold them hostage until you break them. This is another really good example of when you need to implement break bars. So there's quite a lot of nuance to this. Lastly, when you do break a break bar, not only do you get a status ailment, you actually reduce the actual enemy's action value by quite a substantial amount. So think of it a little bit like hitting them with a decreased action. Breaking break bars is definitely a good way to approach really difficult boss fights. So everything we talked about is a lot to get through, but it's all part of what makes Star Rail's combat fun, even though it seems simple on the surface. Managing the turn order, making sure you weave in the perfect ultimate at a critical time, maybe even saving that ultimate up if you need it for a critical juncture to break a bunch of break bars with a big AoE ultimate, or go for a big clutch heal right after a big nuke you know is coming. In addition to that, you also might want to save up skill points for a turn when you know you need to actually put the heals on the entire party. Managing the decision between making 1 or 2 of your carries take a turn off so your support can really buff everyone up and your healer can really go to town. There's tons of nuance and ton to get involved with, and that's just the minute-to-minute combat. Building teams is absolutely a blast as well, so I recommend looking into the team building guide as well. There's so much to unpack, and hopefully you guys have enjoyed the video. Plenty more to come. If you're interested in min-maxing and talking Star Rail, be sure to join the Discord, link down in the comments below. Until next time, cheers.